Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse, and this is episode 117. In today's episode, Dr. Ginevra Liptan will be giving us an update on fibromyalgia research, including information on the paper she has recently published, along with the King's College London study that indicates fibromyalgia may, in fact, have an autoimmune component to it. You may have heard of this as the mouse study or the autoimmune study. We also discuss other research the two of us find interesting, like the research on the use of hyperbaric oxygen for fibromyalgia. We even answer the question, is fibromyalgia an autoimmune condition? Now, let me introduce you to today's guest. A top fibromyalgia expert, Dr. Ginevra is a Tufts University School of Medicine graduate, board certified in internal medicine, and trained in functional medicine. Dr. Ginevra developed fibromyalgia as a medical student and spent many years using herself as a guinea pig to find successful treatments, which she shares in her books, The FibroManual and the Fibro Food Formula. She also shares her information through her line of herbal and magnesium products, Frida Botanicals. For fierce fibro advice from a doctor with personal experience, be sure to check out her YouTube channel. Links to her books, YouTube channel, and the research articles we talk about in this episode can be found on today's show notes page at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/117. As always, the information you hear in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice, nor is it intended to replace consulting with a qualified physician or other healthcare provider. Instead, please share what you learn here with your providers and discuss with them what might be right for you to try. Hi, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. I am so excited to talk to you about some research updates. I've got a lot of questions from people lately about some of the research that's been done on fibromyalgia. I know you just had a paper published, so I am excited to dig in and, have you share/explain some of those things to us.
I'm happy to share/explain as much as I can.
All right. Sounds good. So I know your paper that was just published was kind of a reflection on some other research. Should we start with your paper? Should we start with the research it was based on?
Might make sense to start with the research it was based on, which is the mouse antibody study.
Okay, awesome. And we've gotten lots of questions on that. So this was actually published during the pandemic, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was like June 2021. And because it was during the pandemic, it didn't get maybe as much press as I thought it might have. You know what I mean? I mean, it got some, but not as much as I would have expected.
That's kind of what I thought too, because it was pretty remarkable what they discovered. Why don't you tell folks what the study was, what they looked at, how they did it?
Absolutely. I think it's potentially a real game changer in the world of understanding fibromyalgia. The biggest piece that it showed us was that the immune system is definitely involved in the creation of fibromyalgia pain. And there's been a lot of debate, is fibromyalgia an autoimmune disease? Is it not? As there's sort of debate back and forth, there really hasn't been much clarity around it. And part of the reason is most markers of inflammation in fibromyalgia have been normal. And that has led a lot of doctors to say, you know what? Fibromyalgia is not an inflammatory disease. It's not autoimmune. It shouldn't even be considered in the realm of rheumatology, which is the field that studies kind of inflammatory diseases. It should be just in the realm of neurology. And so it kind of got pushed into that. It kind of got pigeonholed. What this study did is they took antibodies derived from fibromyalgia patients and they infused them into healthy mice. And they compared this to what happened when they infused antibodies from people that did not have fibromyalgia. What they were able to do is when they gave these healthy little mice the fibromyalgia antibodies, they actually induced symptoms of fibromyalgia, essentially. And in particular, they were really looking at pain, because you can't exactly ask a mouse, like, are you feeling foggy today? How's your fatigue on a scale of 1 to 10? What they were able to look at is, how quickly the mouse withdrew its paw, or how sensitive they were to pressure or heat or cold. And what they found was the antibodies from fibromyalgia patients actually induced a state of pain and pain hypersensitivity, or central sensitization, in these mice. This did not happen with antibodies from healthy people. So all of a sudden it was like, wait, could these antibodies actually be causing fibromyalgia pain? And they kind of went one step further, and they were trying to figure out where exactly the antibodies were working, what these antibodies were actually against. Because, an antibody is basically a lock that is looking for a key, which is an antigen. So they were trying to figure out where are these little locks that are floating around in the mice bloodstream? Where are they binding? And what they found was they mostly bound in a tiny part of the peripheral nervous system, which is called the dorsal root ganglia. And this is where it can get a little head swimmy, as far as, even if you're a medical provider, you start to get a lot of acronyms, because they call the dorsal root ganglia the DRG, and then the peripheral nervous system is the PNS, and then it causes central nerve, so I think this is part of why it has been challenging for lay people to kind of understand, hey, what are you talking about? So as I try to break it down for folks, basically what they found was these antibodies bound to a part of the nervous system that's really important in generating pain. So could that binding be actually causing fibromyalgia pain? And that is what the researchers theorized. They said, we think that this is what's happening in fibromyalgia. And that was a huge deal, because all of a sudden it was not only is the immune system involved, but maybe it's actually causing these symptoms. And if the antibodies are binding to things in the dorsal root ganglia, that means antibodies are binding against self, right? If you have an antibody, it's only supposed to bind to foreign invaders, the COVID virus or the flu virus or whatever, whatever it is. We're not supposed to have antibodies that are binding against ourselves, our own tissue. And when they do that, that is considered an autoimmune reaction. That's actually what causes the joint inflammation and pain in rheumatoid arthritis, which is a classic autoimmune disease. So suddenly there was not only the understanding of how important the immune system is, there was a concept of, well, maybe this is actually an autoimmune disease, and maybe this could be useful for treatment, right? All of a sudden it could really expand our options. And I think that's why I was surprised, as it sounds like you were as well. Why did this not get more press? Certainly, at least on Facebook that summer, I saw a huge amount of interest from fibromyalgia folks. There was a lot of interest, and people were sharing it. And, there was certainly, it kind of went viral, so to speak, in our little tiny community of fibromyalgia, but it didn't seem to there weren't rheumatologists who were out there oh my gosh, I'm tweeting this amazing thing that we discovered. So I don't have a good explanation for that, other than fibromyalgia has always struggled to not be embraced in that way. And, COVID has been really distracting.
Yes.
From a medical and societal perspective, right? So
right.
That's kind of why I started to really look into it, so I could understand this study and hopefully be able to explain it to people better.
Mm-hmm. And as somebody who treats patients, is it going to change potentially what you do, as treatment there?
Absolutely. And I think that's where it starts to get really exciting as somebody treating fibromyalgia patients and as somebody with fibromyalgia myself. It's like, well, okay, so does this mean that some of those treatments that we do use for things like rheumatoid arthritis, could those be utilized for fibromyalgia? Or are there other treatments? There's a lot of different ways to approach the immune system and kind of to harness ways to treat things going wrong in the immune system. And I will say the one group that did seem to pay attention to this study was the pharmaceutical companies that had or have a product either currently available or in development that actually targets, maybe autoimmune antibody response. Those, I mean, there's been a huge explosion of research in that area. And anytime there's a lot of interest and dollars being put into fibromyalgia research, I think patients only stand to benefit. You know what I mean? Like we definitely need that to happen. And the pharmaceutical companies are really the ones that drive a lot of the research that's done. The challenging piece is we don't even fully understand how the antibodies exactly are causing pain or causing pain hypersensitivity. So it's until that gets more delineated, more defined, and until there's a lot more studies done on immune system treatments, I think realistically it's going to be at least a few years before we really start seeing treatments coming from this. However, there's already been some case reports published from, a lot of researchers are kind of taking it into their own hands, like, all right, we use this treatment for, let's say, myasthenia gravis. We know that it affects antibodies, particularly autoantibodies that bind against cells. Let's see what happens if we give it to 6 patients, or let's see what happens if we block this receptor or that receptor. And there's already starting to be some published case reports. And the more of those that are published, the more, maybe some rheumatologists down the road might say, like, nothing else has worked, let's try it. But the tricky part is anytime you affect the immune system, it can potentially, so let's say we block one part of the immune system, that's going to put you at risk for certain types of infections, because we need our immune system. So that's going to be the tricky part, is we have to have treatments that are effective enough that they can be worth that potential risk. So I do think it's going to be, while I'm really excited about it, I'm also trying to help kind of temper people's expectations.
The cure isn't coming tomorrow.
Right. Like the silver bullet's not coming tomorrow, as much as I wish it was. But I do view it as a really positive indication, because I think that there's going to be a lot of research interest, a lot of dollars interest in this. And I'm hoping that within a few years, at least within a decade, I think it will absolutely result in more tools in our toolbox. And we desperately need that in fibromyalgia.
Definitely. I mean, in some senses, we even just need a home, right? I remember when I was first looking at fibromyalgia as a possibility, there were a lot of people who had it in that autoimmune category. And then it wasn't. And then it was, rheumatology. Now we're thinking more neurology. Now we're back to.
Oh, yes. It is absolutely an orphan disease that no specialty has really wanted to claim. I've always advocated that we need to create like a new specialty. Like, I'm a fibromyalgist, I do think that this means that it's solidly going to move back into rheumatology. I don't know if rheumatologists are going to embrace it as much, but honestly, part of why I think rheumatologists did not embrace it is because they had so little to offer patients. Whereas with their rheumatoid arthritis patients, they were like, okay, I know, boom, boom, boom. I know this is the marker I need to look at. Here's the lab I need to check. Ah, yes, your joints are less inflamed. I can definitely see that my treatment is working. Whereas fibromyalgia has been much more nebulous. And even the diagnosis, we still don't have, I mean, maybe this will result in a lab test. Maybe there's going to be a specific antibody we can test for, but we still don't even have like a discrete test for it, right? So I think that is why it was so challenging for specialties to treat. I think that was part of it, because doctors, we really do want to help, and we don't have much to offer patients. I don't think it's a conscious decision, but I think there's sort of a subconscious, like, not wanting to deal with it because you feel helpless. You feel like you don't have anything to offer.
Sure. And that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, like, you're going to build your practice around the things that you're good at treating, right?
Exactly.
Fortunately, you were good at treating fibromyalgia, but not all doctors know that.
No,
So
it's absolutely true. And that's why part of my mission is really to try to educate other doctors so that they do feel more empowered, that they do know about, because there are many other tools available, some which are quite effective for fibromyalgia patients. But if doctors don't know about them, they're still stuck in that kind of, I don't know.
right.
Right.
And that's one of the things that potentially could happen here is, okay, this is an autoimmune thing. We move it back to rheumatology, but all those rheumatologists out there, like, their knowledge didn't change overnight.
Exactly. And I'm actually surprised by how few rheumatologists even know about this study. That has been discouraging to me. I'm like, hey, this is literally right in your field. This could be a huge game changer. And so I think even trying to figure out, like, maybe patients need to bring it, hey, let me bring you a copy of this article, Mr. Rheumatologist, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I mean, maybe they have heard of it, but unfortunately, fibromyalgia patients, we often find ourselves in that position of kind of needing to educate our doctors. But the reality is, if we are in that position, we're in that position, and maybe we just need to print out that article. So if I'm sure you'll put a link in the
Yes, I will.
description, but it is the passive transfer of fibromyalgia symptoms via antibody, something like that. So basically, if you search fibromyalgia and mouse, it will come up. And I think that it's actually pretty, at least if you kind of just read the abstract or the summary, it's pretty understandable now that you kind of know some of these key terms, that the dorsal root ganglia is a part of the nervous system that's important in pain regulation. I think most people now, with the COVID pandemic, lots of people are more familiar with the terms antibody, antigen, immune response, cytokines. I think everybody has kind of had to really increase their knowledge of the immune system. So that can help people, I think, to understand the study.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I think was really interesting too is that they gave the antibodies, the mice developed symptoms, and then at the point where the antibodies would be done, die off,
right,
clear
remove,
out,
yep,
whatever
clear,
done means.
Yep.
Then those symptoms went away and they were back to normal.
Absolutely. And that is what makes it so distinct, that the antibodies were involved, and in fact maybe are a fundamental piece of that involvement. I did, and I have puzzled, however, over a few concepts that came up in the study, and that, if I may segue into my own research
Absolutely.
article.
I think your own article is a good next step.
So as I read it, and as I, kind of pondered this article, there was a few things I sort of struggled to understand, or at least some of the other things that we already know about fibromyalgia didn't seem to really correlate with an antibody causing everything. And the things that I'm talking about are things like fatigue, fibrofog, tender points. Why are our muscles what hurts? Why do we develop trigger points? Why do we have sleep disturbance? Why is our autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight nervous system, gone haywire? And the way I kind of was looking at it is, well, could antibodies be causing all of those symptoms? And ultimately what I came to, and this is just my way of thinking about it, and this is kind of my hypothesis, and that's ultimately what I published. This article was really about kind of a hypothesis incorporating the new antibody information into what we already know. And by that, I mean things that have already been kind of scientifically documented, published in lots of different studies. And I do not think that antibodies attacking, if our antibodies are attacking the dorsal root ganglia, and meaning they're seeing it as a foreign entity.
Right. Like in Hashimoto's, your antibodies attacking your thyroid, right?
Exactly. And that's that's like the classic autoimmune reaction, right? Mm-hmm. So if we say, okay, fibromyalgia is explained by antibodies attacking our dorsal root ganglia, that explains pain, and it explains pain hypersensitivity. By that, I mean like central sensitization, the princess and the pea, right? Like something that shouldn't hurt, hurts, things that should only hurt a little bit, hurt a lot. That can certainly explain that. But there's all those other things. And for me personally, one of the treatments that helped the most with my pain were treatments addressing the fascia, the myofascial release that I talk about a lot. And so that's what I was like head scratching, like, okay, so how would something that's working on my muscles, or like a trigger point injection, how would something that works on our muscles why would that get me improvement if the antibodies were still attacking my dorsal root ganglia? Like so that was kind of where I was like, puzzling. And I puzzled for like a year and a half. I had other distractions going on too. So, was intermittent puzzling. And then I did a lot of research. I probably read like 600 research articles about related immune system topics. Cause I was like, wait, what? And the way that I kind of put it together was, I think that the antibodies might be more of a mechanism as to how the sympathetic nervous system and the immune system and the myofascial system interact in such a way to generate central sensitization or pain hypersensitivity. And it's a bit confusing. And I spent about 15 pages kind of trying to document it's just like a research paper like you wrote in high school. You know what I mean? You have to each paragraph, you have to explain what your sources are, right? Exactly. I mean, it's very similar, people. But as I sort of pulled it all together, what I think is happening in fibromyalgia is a trauma, emotional, physical infection triggers a prolonged fight or flight response, activation of the sympathetic nervous system. That generates a lot of muscle and myofascial inflammation and tension. As part of that, the immune system is activated, and we end up with antibodies floating around that are actually really generated from what's going on in the muscle and being perpetuated by the fight or flight nervous system. And then those antibodies bind with tiny little antigens, tiny little proteins and pieces of inflammation generated ultimately from myofascial inflammation. And it's the combination of the antibody and the antigen that actually bind to the dorsal root ganglia and cause central sensitivity. And one of my strongest arguments for this is we see central sensitization in lots of different pain conditions, not just fibromyalgia.
Right.
So things like complex regional pain syndrome, you can actually take antibodies from people with complex regional pain syndrome, give it to little mice, these poor mice, give it to them. They also exhibit that same pain hypersensitivity. So it seems to be like, it's almost like the antibodies are the way that central sensitization is triggered in the body. So it may be that those antibodies are really more a reflection of what's happening to generate the central sensitization rather than being directed at the dorsal root ganglion as if attacking the dorsal root ganglia. And this is where it is confusing. It absolutely is. And you really have to kind of dive deep into understanding the immune system, the sympathetic nervous system, the myofascial system, how that all interacts. And this is just my hypothesis. It's my theory that is able to sort of put everything that we know about fibromyalgia in some sort of like chain reaction hypothesis. I could be totally wrong, and the researchers that published the mouse antibody study could be totally right, and it could be actually just an autoantibody response at the dorsal root ganglia that's causing the whole shebang, and maybe that's generating enough neuroinflammation to cause fibrofog and fatigue and sleep disturbance. 100%, I don't care if I'm right or wrong. We need to figure this out.
Yeah, keep the conversation going, right? Not just
Exactly.
have this study that dropped and then nobody really talks about it.
Right. And the weird thing to me is like, why didn't that generate like 20 other studies like the next year? Like, oh, let's look at this and let's pull this out. And what happens if we do it in, a rabbit? Or, that's the part that I'm like, why did it just sort of sink into like a black hole of like, oh, that's a really interesting thing. We gave some mice fibromyalgia and okay, moving on to the next thing. And that's really frustrating. And I feel like, I'm so glad that we're talking about this on your podcast. And I think that fibromyalgia patients are going to keep this conversation alive, because I don't know about you, but I get a lot of questions about this.
Yes.
And the most common question I get is fibromyalgia an autoimmune disease? And that's a really huge question that we got to keep asking. And we got to keep saying like, hey, more research needs to be done. And, as they start looking at more and more drugs that affect the immune system, maybe even that will show us what part of the immune system is actually happening. For example, one treatment is something called IVIG, where they basically give you a whole bunch of antibodies. It's like a whole mixture of antibodies that dilute all the antibodies enough that kind of knocks antibodies, abnormal antibodies.
Ones.
Exactly. It knocks them off their receptors, right? And so I've actually anecdotally had patients, I've had some fibromyalgia patients that were getting IVIG for other things come tell me like, oh my gosh, I felt so much better for like a month or two. The problem is that's not sustainable. It's really expensive and it's not sustainable for like long term. But if that information starts to show us like, oh, reducing antibodies really is a way, whatever's generating the antibodies, wherever they're working, if we can reduce the negative ones, reduce the autoantibodies, okay, that's going to be great information. That's maybe going to like put us in this direction. And then, this study shows, well, actually, also you have to work on this particular cytokine. Like, okay, now that pushes us in. So that is another way to sort of dial in and figure out more and more about what's going on in fibromyalgia. One thing I just want to reiterate, though, is the immune system is incredibly complex. There's literally like a million different pieces happening at once, all sorts of different directions. And immunology is one of the hardest classes in med school because of that. And we just keep learning more and more about the immune system. So I'm sure immunology now is like 20 times harder. So that's why it's so hard to just say, yes. It's really, the immune system is hard to simplify. That's what I would say. So even when I try to explain like my theory, I'm always like, well, actually you need to read my 16 pages because, it's really hard to like just quickly and easily summarize. And this is where I get a lot of questions like, well, you're saying there's inflammation in fibromyalgia, but my doctor told me my inflammation markers are normal. And this is because the standard test, there's 2 tests we typically use, the SED rate on the CRP, those do tend to be normal in fibromyalgia. But there's like 20 other different markers that are abnormal in fibromyalgia. They just aren't commonly tested in the clinical setting. They're used in research. So I think this is part of why it's so like confusing and frustrating for both patients and doctors, because it's like, wait, there's no inflammation in fibromyalgia because, those 2 tests are normal. And I was like, okay, that's like a really simplistic view of things, people. So to keep in mind that it is a very complex system. I mean, just look at COVID. Look at how flummoxed we have been as far as like effective treatments, right? Like I would say the best medical minds in the world have been dedicated to pretty much looking at COVID for the past, oh my gosh, how long has it been? 25 years? I don't know. It feels like that.
I think it's just 3, but.
Oh my gosh, really? Oh my gosh, you're right. Okay. So, and there's so much we don't understand. And there's so much we don't understand about long COVID and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So just to kind of help people like put it in that kind of context of the immune system is complicated. It's going to take us a while to figure it out. But this does mean that we can start looking more at, right, what are these ways that we can address the immune system? And should it be lumped into the autoimmune category? I will say time will tell. Time will tell.
So the answer to the question, is fibromyalgia an autoimmune condition? The answer is we don't know yet, but there does seem to be an immune system component.
Bingo. Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner. Yes, that is, I would say, the immune system. What the mouse antibody study showed us is that without a doubt, definitively 100%, we can say that the immune system is involved in generating fibromyalgia pain. And that itself is a huge deal. I mean, and it's yet another objective, meaning measurable abnormality. Like we're still fighting for legitimacy as a real illness in some areas, so the more objective data that we have, the more accepted fibromyalgia will be. The more accepted it is, the more patients, I think, can get effective treatment. Because there are still doctors that, I hear like horror stories every day. I don't know if you hear those too. That
all
just
the time.
break my heart. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God. I feel the need to like apologize for like my fellow doctors. I'm like, the things people say, it's terrible. Terrible.
I know. It's just crazy. And, it reminds me of all the things that we talked about in relation to the documentary with Invisible and Nick, the director, talking about how hard it was to fundraise for the film and how he's literally raised millions of dollars for other things, but had such a hard time getting funding for this film. And even, as we were trying to get the film into festivals and things like that, like it's just not considered sexy, I guess.
Totally not. I know. And I think that it's also been incredibly hard. Compared to other illnesses, fibromyalgia is really common. So you would think, hey, there's going to be so much research dollars,
because it affects so many people. Right. Like,
but yet there has never been the research dollars that it warrants. And that's always just kind of boggled my mind, like how can something that affects so many people be so underfunded? And I've even known some researchers that really had to like crowdfund their own research. And it, that was the same with the documentary, which I felt like was such an important piece of work, and I was like, how is it that they weren't able to just get so much money. And I can't, my backup plan is always Lady Gaga, but that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I'll put it out there. Come on, Lady Gaga. Come on.
We need a fibromyalgia fairy godmother or something, I think.
I bought some of her makeup recently, and it's pretty wild and crazy makeup. But I was like, okay, I'm supporting you, Lady Gaga. Come on.
Support us in return. I love it.
Right. But that cannot be, we cannot be relying on a fairy godmother to, you know.
It's just a symptom of like the whole thing with fibromyalgia, right? Like invisible was called invisible for a reason, right? Because it's like nobody sees us, nobody, you know.
I call it the F word of medicine because it really is. It is like, it's better now, but 20 plus years ago when I was in med school, it was really like a dirty word. Like you uttered it, or you said like, hey, I'm going to give a presentation on fibromyalgia. And you could literally, it was like a stampede of doctors running away. And I was like, what? Okay. So it's certainly better. So I want to give people at least the hope and understanding that we have gained so much ground. For the most part, fibromyalgia is absolutely accepted as a real condition. We have now a lot of documented abnormalities that we can say, yep, we know there's sleep issues. We know there's autonomic nervous system issues. We know that there's immune system issues, hormonal issues,
it's a
nutritional
real
issues,
thing, right?
Inflammation issues. Absolutely. And so with the just literally thousands upon thousands of articles that are out there now kind of documenting that, we are light years ahead. And I'm really hoping that this mouse antibody study, which really confirms the immune system's involvement, will push us that next step further. And I am diligently trying to do my part to keep the conversation going in the scientific community. I think, I'm going to a conference in a little bit, and I'm just going to literally bring copies of my article and hand them out.
I love it. Here you go. Do you have one of these yet?
I'm going to be that annoying person on the street. Like, would you like to read my pamphlet? Well, you're going to read it.
That's what we need.
Right?
It really kind of is.
And I think I've gotten to the point in life where I'm sort of like, F it. You know what I mean? Like, all right, I'll be seen as like the crazy one in the room. Like, okay, if that's what it takes, like, all right.
Yep.
I'll play that role. You know what
I mean? Thank you.
I made it well. Feel like I think that the other thing is, I think that we all kind of, it can be so hard to advocate for yourself when you're so exhausted in dealing with fibromyalgia, but there is strength in numbers. And so I think that was the part of Invisible and doing that event with you, events was so great, was connecting with the community. And we absolutely need to like keep inspiring each other and keep the fight going,
Yep. Together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what other bits of research are out there floating around? Anything you're aware of that people are working on, or other recent studies that you've found encouraging?
There's a lot of interest in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which you and I were talking before.
Yes, that's my favorite bit of research.
and you have some experience with it, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's been really interesting to try some of these things. I mean, it's I'm in a different place, so it's harder for me to know, like, I don't have fibro pain right now, so I can't tell you how it worked for that.
Right.
But just the experience itself. And I think it's becoming a lot more accessible. I have friends who run I guess you might call it a clinic, but they've got where you can just go in, just like you might go in go floating or go get a
Right.
massage or go have
Yep.
acupuncture. You can
Yep.
go have your hyperbaric oxygen. But one of the things I found so interesting about, I think it was the study in Israel, they did it for 30 days. They did 20 sessions over 30 days. So
Yep.
basically Monday through Friday for a month. And at the end, some of the people like 0 symptoms.
Oh, yes, it is. I actually met one of the Israeli researchers who's done a lot of the studies there, and they've looked at hyperbaric oxygen therapy for a lot of things. And just for those listeners that aren't familiar with it, hyperbaric means basically extra pressure, and then oxygen, kind of self-explanatory. So you're in either a soft-walled tank or a hard-walled tank, and inside are higher levels of oxygen. So sometimes you're breathing from like an oxygen mask or it's piped in, and there's also increased pressure. So it's basically, the way I think about it is it's kind of forcing oxygen into your tissue. And in particular, it forces oxygen into your brain. And what we have seen is hyperbaric oxygen therapy reduces neuroinflammation. It reduces glial cell activation, which we know glial cells are a big part of generating central sensitization. And I was recently reading a study that it actually activates opioid receptors in the brain. So it actually can generate pain reduction through the opioid receptors. And they're even using it to help people with opioid withdrawal. So people that are coming off opioids, you put them in a tank, it activates their own opioid receptors, which are hungry for the opioids they're not on anymore. That like blew my mind. I was like, holy cow. So I think it has a lot of potential. I think it's something that is pretty exciting. If we could get insurance coverage for it, that would be like the hallelujah. Like it can help in a lot of different conditions. I had a patient with Lyme disease who felt like hyperbaric oxygen was really key in her recovery.
They're using it in long COVID.
Yep.
I have a friend who posts pictures every now and then of her in the.
Yep. I think it could be something that like could really improve a lot of conditions. And I've had a couple patients that did it. And what was really cool, one of my patients reported significant improvement in brain fog. And there's not a lot of treatments that you can say definitively, oh yeah, definitely reduced my fog from an 8 to 2. And she was like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden my brain is working again. And you know what? Our brains really need oxygen. They really like oxygen.
Surprisingly.
Right? So I think that one is super exciting. I think there's the Stanza app, which is coming out, which is, I've had a little interaction with the company making that. It's basically like an app that helps you use some behavioral therapy techniques, something called, I think it's called acceptance conditioning or thinking, basically kind of shifting the way you think about things and kind of, harnessing your own nervous system to help quiet your fight or flight response.
Right.
And I think things like that, I mean, there's other things out there like that. I think anything that is simple and hopefully inexpensive or free and it's on our phone, I think those things are always exciting. And then you were telling me there's some drug trials that are kind of in their third.
Yes, the Tonix Pharmaceuticals is in their phase 3 trial, I think, for their new medication. That's episode 110, if anybody wants to check out that. But yeah, they're hopefully like, next year, sometime year after that, maybe. That's the other thing. We have this research that gets done, but it takes so long before that actually like shows up in your doctor's office for you to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. They call that the research to practice gap, which prior to the era of the internet used to be about a decade. Now with the internet, it's shortened. Now it's like 4 or 5 years. Part of why I wrote the FibroManual was to shorten that even more. I wanted everybody who read the FibroManual to be as up to date as I was on the causes of fibromyalgia treatments, so that they could like shorten that gap, go into their doctor and be like, hey, I heard about hyperbaric oxygen. Could I try that? I heard about low dose naltrexone. Could I try that? What about, this or that? And I still And I think that's part of what you also do on the podcast, is you're trying to bring that information directly to patients, to your listeners. I'm sure there's healthcare providers that also listen to you. I'm sure there's many. But if we can do anything to shorten that gap,
Yeah,
patients benefit, you know?
absolutely. And I think that's where we need to not be afraid as patients to help shorten that gap by bringing a copy of your paper to the doctor, right? And say,
Absolutely.
here, I heard about this, you know.
Absolutely. It has to be done in the right way. I wish I had numbered my episodes on my YouTube channel, because it would be like, go to what, but
I can tell you, it's episode
oh
113.
yeah, because it was like
The
helping your doctor help you,
Yes, the talk that
right?
you gave
Yes,
at our graduation.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think that if you bring it to them in the right way, it can become a partnership, and that's what it really should be. And
Mhm.
then they don't feel threatened, and you guys can explore interesting new things together. I mean, I think hyperbaric oxygen's pretty exciting. You can actually do home tanks too. They have
Yes,
home
you can
tanks,
buy
you know,
your
you can
own.
get.
Yeah, yeah. And I again, I have some friends that have found this particularly helpful, and they've done that. They've bought their own so they can do it. I mean, you know, if you find something that helps you a lot, then you probably want to find a way to be able to do that for yourself, right? Like myofascial release, for instance, right?
Exactly.
Like there's ways to do self myofascial release, but
Absolutely.
can't
Yes.
always, but when you
No.
can.
Yes. And one of the things that I fight for a lot is insurance coverage of things, because, you know, that the reality is a lot of people can't afford something that's not going to be covered by their insurance.
Mhm.
And I think we have to advocate for ourselves that, you know, hey, this needs to be covered. And insurance companies aren't going to want to cover it unless there's a good data. So the more hyperbaric oxygen therapy data comes out, the better of the argument is that they should cover it.
Mhm.
So that's also, I would say, like, research comes first, then it comes to clinical practice, and then several years later, insurance companies begrudgingly will be like, all right, I guess we'll do something. So, you know, we have to.
Right.
Is
And you know, if nobody's asking for it, then
exactly the squeaky wheel, as they say, right? Gets the oil.
Mhm. Yes, and things like hyperbaric oxygen, like, you know, if we find something that addresses this autoimmune component,
Mhm.
it, those are things that are already kind of covered, right? They use hyperbaric oxygen like in burn victims,
Exactly, and
right?
wounds, yes.
Yeah, so the you know, they already exist, they're already covered, like we're just expanding the codes that
Exactly, like they're covered for other
yeah.
conditions, so why not, you know?
Mhm.
And I think a lot of hospitals, actually, at least in the Portland area, a lot of them do have the hyperbaric tanks, because they are so incredibly useful for wound healing, burns. Also. So yeah, it's not like they have to. They don't have to. What do you call it? Like, create a new wheel, or
Yes, yeah, and it's
right?
not
Like,
some out there weird thing that nobody's using for anything else, right?
exactly right. It's not like drink some horse urine and, you know, blah 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 blah, dance around under the moon. I mean, it's like a scientific thing. So yeah.
Yes, yes, exactly. So a couple questions on that mouse study. How did they get the antibodies? I because what popped into my head when we were talking about that is, oh my goodness, if I donate blood, is somebody going to get my antibodies and have fibro for a month?
Interestingly, that also popped into my head. I was like, wait. So the antibodies were purified from the blood, and they didn't isolate it down to like, it's these antibodies. They just pulled out all the what are called IgG antibodies, which is a certain class of antibodies, pulled all of those out, and then infused them into the mice, and then did the same for healthy folks. It is possible, theoretically, that you could induce that somebody getting that blood might experience that in like experience fibromyalgia symptoms. However, because antibodies can just wreak havoc on the immune system. Most blood that you get is actually purified from antibodies. Like the antibodies are usually, the bulk of them are removed because they don't want antibodies. So let's say my Ginevra antibodies recognize my own tissues, but they're not going to recognize Jane's tissues, right? There's going to be a little bit of the same reason why there's transplant. Exactly. So because of that, they actually pull out most of the antibodies. There can still be a little bit left, but not enough to cause. So you can freely give blood and not feel like you're going to give any symptoms. And one question I get a lot of is, well, is there a fibromyalgia antibody? Like, were they able to isolate it down? In rheumatoid arthritis, there's a few antibodies that are they're able to pull it down, and they're called rheumatoid factor. They like literally can isolate. Yeah.
Tested for.
Right. Yeah. It's like there's 3 or 4 or something specific antibodies. They weren't able to, so they put the fibromyalgia antibodies through this kind of like filtering system that tries to figure out like, well, is there one specific antibody? No, there wasn't. Is there one specific group of antibodies? No, there wasn't. What they found was actually, it was a whole bunch of different antibodies across that actually reacted against a whole lot of different things, some different cellular components. And that's part of why my argument was like, well, that doesn't make sense. If it was against DRG, cells, it would be more narrow. So they weren't able to do that. Although, as I said, the immune system is complicated, and they just did one particular filtering technique. And it may be that is something down the road where they're able to pull it out. And if they can isolate it down to, like, let's say a fibromyalgia factor, there's rheumatoid factor, fibromyalgia factor. If they can isolate it down to that would be diagnostic. That would be amazing and huge. And I would have to eat humble pie and say I was wrong.
But you would be happy to do that, I know.
Clearly, give me
just
more.
For an answer.
Second helping. Yes, come on, bring it on. So yeah, very good question. You're very thoughtful.
Yeah. I know I've had several people ask me, is it okay if I give blood, not just because of the study, but just in general. And I've had other people tell me that they were not allowed to give blood because they had fibromyalgia.
Oh, see, that's interesting. I wonder if that might be going forward until it's more sorted out. Oh my goodness, I had not heard that, but that kind of might make sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. At least until they know more.
Right. Until we clarify a little bit.
Yeah.
It is really, the whole thing is so interesting. I always use the analogy of the blind man and the elephant. I mean, this, for those of you who don't know, the blind men come up with an elephant, and each blind man is touching a different part of the elephant, trying to figure out what it is. One says, oh, it's a wall, because he's touching the side. And one of them says, oh, it's a fan, because he's touching the ear. One of them says, no, it's a snake, because he's got the trunk. So we've got another piece of the elephant.
That is a perfect analogy for both fibromyalgia, but also the immune system.
Yeah,
that's why it's so complicated, because every little piece you look at is just one piece. Oh, that's a really good analogy. And what I was trying to explain in my article that was published was the elephant. I was trying to put it all together into.
Yeah, and someday, hopefully, we can, right?
Yeah.
Or somehow figure out what's going on.
We will. We absolutely will. We will figure out. I think in your and I's lifetime, I mean, we will figure out what's going on in fibromyalgia, and I firmly believe have much more effective treatments within the decade. That's what I think.
I think so too. I mean, there's enough people well, not enough, but there are many of us out there who are finding some of the things that work and finding ways to feel better, and, in a repeatable way. I know that's how I feel with my clients, and I'm sure you felt that way with your patients. Like, I can repeat this. This isn't just a one-off.
Right.
And that gives us clues and helps, helps find some of those answers. If this works,
Absolutely.
then what can we
Absolutely.
determine
Right.
from that?
Right. And what's hard is that, like, even with that, I love myofascial release. There's lots of studies showing it's helpful. I recommend it to all my patients. Not everybody who did myofascial release found benefit. Like, most people did, but not everybody. Some people are like, oh, actually, acupuncture is much more helpful, or this kind of chiropractic, or this. So that's the other pieces. It's like there is some individuality, but like globally, if people do things to reduce inflammation, whatever they do to do that, they feel better. Globally, if people improve their myofascial health, they feel better. Globally, if they improve their sleep quality, they feel better. Now, how we get to each of those goals might look a little different, but at least we like have that piece, right? And like that's moving us forward, as opposed to like where we were 20 years ago, where we were still arguing about whether it was real or not.
Right.
Right?
I would say that's an improvement.
Heck yes. Yes. Finally.
Oh gosh. So for everybody out there listening, as they, see these articles, I mean, for me, it's almost always Facebook.
Yep.
Right? Somebody posts something that gives you like this, here's the answer. What kind of advice, what kind of tips, what would you say to them to just kind of, I don't know, help? Sometimes it can really feel like a crapshoot. Is this real? Is this not real? How do I even know?
Absolutely. And it can be so confusing and overwhelming. Like, oh, do I need to take that supplement or this? Or no, it's the, yeah, I remember feeling that way when I was first diagnosed. It's very, very confusing. So what I would say is take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. Try to do research on it, and not just like internet research, but actually if you go to pubmed.gov, that's where kind of a repository of journal research articles. For example, if you want to look up mine, just look up my name and mine will pop up. Just saying, shameless plug. No. But if a treatment is on there, then you can actually look at like, okay, like has this been looked at in a study? Not everything has, and it's not that is a perfect way, but that's, I think, one place to at least start. I think trying to intuitively go with what feels right to you, and this, I'm going to sound a little woo-woo, but sometimes we'll kind of be drawn to something like, wow, that myofascial release, that sounds really interesting. I feel like that might really help me. Or there might be sort of like, well, somebody else got benefit, but it's not really resonating as much with me. So a little bit of understanding our own intuition. I think we underestimate that. And then talking about it with your healthcare provider, knowing that they might have their own bias. I think doing your research, and there's usually not much harm in trying something unless it's incredibly expensive. And that is actually one area to just run it by your healthcare provider. Like, hey, is this algae extract going to interfere with my medications, or is it toxic? Okay, no, it's non-toxic. All right, it's worth a try. And I am a big proponent of the guinea pig method. I mean, many of my patients were gracious enough to be guinea pigs. And I also kind of have considered myself that, right? Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I tried so many wacky things and tried so many avenues looking for different treatments, and some worked, some didn't, but I learned something from each of it, I would say. So as long as it's not harmful or incredibly expensive, I think it's reasonable to try something, as long as you've done some of that preliminary research. That's kind of my 2 cents. What do you tell? What's your advice?
Yeah.
I'm curious, not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious, like what because you get that question a lot, and I know you're not a doctor, but I'm sure that in your health coaching role, people run things by you.
Yeah, there's still ways to know. I mean, I think one of the first things I look at is, where is this coming from? And is it a reputable source?
Right.
Right. So, if somebody posts something and you click on it and the website looks spammy and
Right.
there's pop-up ads and you can't, you go down to the bottom and you try to see who owns the website and you can't figure out. Yeah, no.
Yeah. That's good advice. That's solid
So that's
advice.
the first thing, but also like just obviously you post something that's going to have more weight for me knowing you and trusting
Oh,
you
yeah.
than maybe somebody I don't know. So that's a big piece. But then look up like if they talk about a study, looking that up, or for a while there was like apple cider vinegar was the cure for everything,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So going looking, are there studies with apple cider vinegar?
Right. Right. Periodically, like every few years, there's that thing that's like, this is going to, I mean, CBD was that a few years ago. Like CBD
Yeah.
definitely has its benefits, but it was like, this is a panacea and it like cures cancer and, all these other things. And it was like, let's actually look at what the,
right.
it shows. Yeah. Okay. It can help some
Yeah.
things.
And then I think the other thing too is there isn't just one fix. Like I know going in, there is not going to be one magic bullet, because if there was one magic bullet, we wouldn't still have this mystery of fibromyalgia.
Totally.
Right.
Totally. And we'd all be like, yep, took that, better, done.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that. So the other thing that I always make sure and tell people is, we're not looking for that magic bullet. So, if you try something and it helps a little, that's not a bad thing. Take that little bit and add more to it. Right.
Yes. Like five things that help 5%, that 25% improvement there, right?
Right. Yeah. But you're not as likely to find one thing that does 25%, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's really solid advice. And honestly, I do take my role very seriously. And I've tried, in the past, I tried to like post a lot on social media and, tried to get help with folks coming up with content and stuff. But what I realized is it takes me forever to like write a post or do a video, because I want so much to like make sure that I've really like fact checked it, I've researched it, that the science is sound. So what I'm trying to promote is like that quality over quantity. And so that like I can be, not that I know everything, not that I'm like an expert on every aspect of everything fibromyalgia related, but I know more than your average bear about fibromyalgia, I will say. And I take my role very seriously. And that's the other thing is like, is the information coming from somebody that is viewing it that way, or is somebody just like reposting something from who knows where, from a multi-level marketing somewhere? You know what I mean? So yeah.
Yes, being a trusted source. And this is a perfect time for you to tell people how to find you as a trusted source. Why don't you share that?
Okay. All right. So Dr. Ginevra is the simplest way to find me. It's Ginevra. So you spell my first name. If you want to look up my article name, it's kind of long. It's The Widespread Myofascial Pain of Fibromyalgia is Sympathetically Maintained and Immune Mediated. Simpler to just go to pubmed.gov and put in my name, or even just my last name. Or just go to
FibroMyalgiaPodcast.com/ what is our episode number?
117.
117. And we'll have a link to your paper.
I have so much fun on your podcast. I just have to say, you are awesome. So that is how to find me. And it's got links for my books. And then I'm really trying to make a lot more videos on YouTube. So you can also search me at Dr. Ginevra on YouTube.
Awesome. But you are not active on Facebook that much, right?
I did a lot this summer. I'm sort of intermittently active. I have like a love, mostly hate relationship.
Social media isn't always that good for our nervous system,
Exactly. So I have been doing some there, but I've been primarily trying to create content for my YouTube channel, because I think that is such an accessible way for people to get information. And I actually did a much better job of explaining my theory, my hypothesis, in a a YouTube video. So if you want to learn more about that, and I go a bit more into the science and in a way that I think is hopefully understandable.
Awesome. We'll have a link to that too. We'll put that in today's show notes as well to make it easier for folks to find.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank you.
always fun having you on. We should just do this periodically.
I agree. And I have so much fun when I'm on your podcast, and I just love that you're doing this on your episode 117. Congrats. That's so huge.
That's awesome. I haven't, by the time this episode comes out, I will have posted this, but at the time we're recording this, I have not posted this, but we have 500,000 downloads. We just crossed that number. Yeah.
That's huge. Congratulations.
Thank
oh my
you.
gosh.
And it's all your fault.
I can no longer take credit. It's all you. You were destined for this, my dear.
For those of you who don't know, she was the final shove that, pushed me over the line to create the podcast.
She was pondering it, and I was like, you got to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Have a good time on your trip, and we'll figure out when to have you back and talk about more good stuff.
Sounds great. All right. Bye-bye.
And that wraps up today's Fibromyalgia Research Update with Dr. Ginevra. Remember to subscribe to her YouTube channel to get updates from her directly. And, of course, you can subscribe to this podcast to hear from me. Dr. Ginevra has been a guest on this podcast many times. If you want to hear more from her, check out episode 113, which is a talk she gave to our most recent graduating class on how to help your doctor help you. Episode 106, When Life Implodes, where she shares about how her own life imploded last year. And episode 18, which is about CBD for fibromyalgia. She also talks about Frida Botanicals, her line of herbal and CBD products in that episode. She also was a guest for episode 5, where we talked about what fibromyalgia is from her perspective as a doctor who has fibromyalgia and treats fibromyalgia. Lots of good episodes with Dr. Ginevra for you to check out. And now I've got this week's listener shout out for you. This is an email I received recently from Georgie. She is a graduate of our Certified Fibromyalgia Advisor program, and she wrote to give me an update on her life and her fibromyalgia since she graduated. At one point, she said, "I want to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to you for your knowledge, hope, and inspiration over the years. I can't imagine where I would be and what I would be doing if I had not discovered you. You literally changed my life, and I'm really proud of where I'm at and the business that I'm creating." Thank you so much, Georgie. I know I told you this directly, but it means so much to me to hear from people who have graduated and gone on and continued to improve their lives, and to hear what you're up to. What I do is really all about creating more people who can go help more people. And if we can just kind of keep spreading that, eventually, hopefully, we can eventually reach everybody. Like Dr. Ginevra and I were talking about, fibromyalgia sometimes feels like we're invisible. And I think so often we are the ones who have to help ourselves, whether that's me helping me or me helping you so you can go help somebody else who has fibromyalgia. We just want to keep spreading like a very positive virus, and keep spreading the information, keep spreading the hope, keep spreading the things that we know help, and hopefully help more people feel better. For links to everything we talked about today, remember, you can just go to today's show notes, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/117. See you back here next time.